Fear. Notice the way we respond just when we hear that word. Notice what comes up for you. Fear. There's an aliveness in the room that suddenly changed. It's like the mind of the room is shut. Don't you think it's funny that the way we've been brought up to relate to fear is either to cower, build a comfortable life, and avoid ever looking in the direction of something that might be confrontational? Or if I was to say this more personal self-development movement, which is like, smash through your fears and put some grit into it and work hard. What if there's a third way? What if there's a way to walk with the fear, be embodied and integrated with it, and allow it in? Instead of running or fighting with it, realize that fear is a motivation. This is what I call metafear. Meta comes from the old Greek word to move through or beyond. When we step through our ideas and concepts of fear, it becomes an enlivening force. I realize I'm saying fear, and some of you are probably thinking, well, maybe I don't have any fears. Skydiving, that kind of stuff. But how about simple fears? How about telling our loved ones that we love them? Or our co-workers or friends how we really feel about them? One of the funny things I found with fear is that when we have the opportunity of feeling it, that's a blessing. The problem is, the way we live our lives, a lot of the time, the fears are camouflaged in these stories. I'm not good enough. Maybe later. That's just not me. But here's the good one. I'm waiting for the right time. What if all of these are just layers to hide us from the fear? And I invite you to begin to ask the question of what would happen if you were to begin stepping into that space a little bit more. So I came to Australia as a refugee around the age of 5, so it's about this big. I was extremely shy, I was extremely quiet. I used to stutter when I spoke. And funnily stuff in my native tongue, I still do. So communicating was really hard for me, especially landing in a country where I didn't know the language or the culture. The most common question that people asked me was, well, they didn't even ask me. They would ask the friend I'd usually have standing next to me, does he ever speak? Now, I wasn't intellectually stupid, but the words would just not come out of me. It was a terrifying idea to even begin to talk and then to face the judgment of like, oh my God, I'm special or something's not right with me. I remember in about grade 4, we had this thing with the teachers called reading time. And the whole class would open up the book they're reading and they'd all read through it. And me and 2 other children were invited to come into the special room, which was this tiny room on the side. And in that room, they would play, you guys remember cassette tapes? Showing my age. They would play a cassette tape for us and give us a copy of the book that was exceptionally big with really big font. And we would listen to the cassette tape and follow along in our books. I sat through about a term of this. Towards the end of the term, they're like, okay, they've had enough practice, let's give them a chance to read. And when it came to my turn to read and I opened up the book, I was excited. I was like, yes, I can finally show them that I can read. And I read through that thing without a problem. And I remember looking up and seeing the 2 teachers' aides looking at each other in absolute shock. In that moment, they realized they'd kept me in that class. And not at the time, but now, like 10, 15, 20 years later, I realized that I kept myself in that class. I could read perfectly well, but I was too afraid to say it. Have any of you ever felt like you hid from who you really were because you were afraid of being judged? Because you were afraid of what might come up if you stood up for yourself? Maybe because you were afraid of something different. I lived the first 20 years of my life like that. Now, the interesting thing I discovered about fear is, maybe first I'll add that I started meditation before I started touching fear. And I feel it's like you need a cup of water. You need a cup to drink the water. Meditation is a good practice to have to start feeling fear. Otherwise, we just don't know what it is. Scientifically, we say fear is a combination of two chemicals, adrenaline and cortisol. When they start flooding the body, the brain becomes hyper alert, the pupils dilate, the blood rushes from our organs into the muscles to be available for fight or flight. The other side of the science is that fear is just a concept. Can we study it equally in animals and insects as we do in humans? When you start asking that question, you're like, it's very much a human concept that might have biological and neurological effects tied into it. So through meditation and through accepting the invitations that arose from meditation, I found myself progressively stepping into areas that was more and more uncomfortable. Running a small team, running a bigger team, getting to a stage where I was running an event where 200 odd people had attended for New Year's Eve, and here I was with no training, no preparation, the shy, quiet boy that grew up hiding, about to speak in front of 200 odd people. And I realized I couldn't fight the fear, and I couldn't prepare myself against it. But what I could do is lean into it. And the moment we lean into fear, it begins to flow through us. This became a very addictive practice for me. I was like, that thing that took me weeks, not weeks, but hours, sometimes to reach in meditation, that pure stillness where everything is just beautiful and open and I feel one with everything around me. I was like, the moment I step into fear, that happens straight away. It doesn't need preparation. It's like, we're here. And a part of me began wondering, why was I never taught this in the past? But it also grew this uncanny fascination of where can I lean into my fears more often? And it led me to this beautiful discovery. Language largely defines the way we interact with the world. Mastery in one way can be termed our ability to see perceptions. In your field, you have far more perceptions and categories than anyone else outside of it, right? In English, we have one word for fear. Maybe anxiety, if we get a bit creative. What I loved is in ancient Hebrew, they had two words which were both commonly translated to fear. One of them was pahad. And pahad is pretty similar to the way we relate to fear in everyday life. The unpleasant future of something that might happen and we'd rather avoid. Okay? We all know that one. The second one was yira. And notice even when I say that word, how it just resonates through the space. Now, the interesting thing with yira is it's the word that was often used in association with the fear of God. And they spoke of it in terms of meeting God and meeting angels. And the literal translation is closer to awe. One rabbi says it's literally the experience of having far more energy or sensation running through your body than you're used to. Now, if we take our cultural ideas of God out of the picture and just treat it perhaps as the doorway to meeting a greater part of ourselves, a greater part of us that we haven't even met yet, maybe that we're terrified of because we've been sticking in those habitual places that are nice and comfortable, that becomes really exciting. One of my clients contacted me recently and he said, Miroslav, all of the relationships in my life have drastically changed since I started doing this. My father, my girlfriend, those closest to me, my work, everything begins to change when I started doing this in my life. And he goes, before working with you, I would have said that these are just ingrained parts of my personality. That's just who I am and there's nothing I can do about it. Where he goes, now I'm actually looking to seek out those moments to discover who I really am, so I'm not living in the repetitive cycles of my life. So someone once asked me, how do we do this? How do we deal with fear? Or how do we embrace fear? I like to call this concept Metafear. How do we have a relationship with it? Let's close our eyes for a moment. As you close your eyes, take a breath. What's that one area that you've been putting off? Maybe avoiding, maybe you know you're afraid of it, maybe you just have excuses about it. Take another breath. Meet that with your presence. And perhaps notice how it feels to be surrounded by the idea of doing this. Maybe your breath gets short, maybe your muscles clenched up, maybe your jaw does. Take another little breath. And take a much deeper breath. As you exhale, let everything soften for a moment and just feel the sensations in the body. And outside of those ideas and excuses, I invite you to imagine what's possible on the other side that you may not even be aware of. Take another deep breath. 2 more deep breaths. And 1 more time. Inhale all the way through the belly, through the chest. Beautiful. As you exhale, let's come back into the space. Just open your arms. Notice how the mind of the room already feels a little bit more spacious, a little bit more light. So about 5 years ago, my mother was going through cancer. And quite often, I found myself driving her to and from the treatments. And this one time, as we were driving, we got into an argument. She was like, Miroslav, the problem with you is you just don't care enough. And I was like, Mum, the problem with you is you care too much. And it was a typical relationship that we had. And in our family, we were always loving, we were never emotionally open. We never really connected on that depth. It was more of like, I'm her son, she's my mother, that's the role we're playing. And on this moment, as we kept arguing, she got upset and she started going a little bit quiet. And a part of me wanted to keep going with that pattern and to keep enforcing my point of view. But I stopped, I took a breath just like I invited you to. And I asked myself, what's not being expressed here? Because there's more to our relationship than what we're sharing here. And as those words came up inside me, I felt myself shrivel into my skin, look down and think, I'm not saying that one. For the next 15 minutes, we rode in the car in silence, the thoughts not being able to get out of my head. There's simple little words that I wanted to express to her. We pulled into the hospital. She looked at me, and my hands trembling, kind of like the way they are now. I looked over to her and said, Mum, there's something I want to say to you. And we got out of the car. I held her hands, my heart pounding. I looked at her in the eyes and I said, thank you so much for giving birth to me. I walked away from that situation, my heart still pounding. It was one of the most terrifying things I'd done in my life. It doesn't sound like it, does it? My relationship with her changed from that moment on. She opened up to me more in those last few weeks of her life than probably the previous 25 odd years altogether. Could I have foreseen that would happen? No. I was too involved with how uncomfortable it would feel if I do it. And before she passed, she said to me, Miroslav, those words you said to me, they just lit up my whole world. Even though I was walking through a hospital to go to a treatment, I just felt so alive. One of the last conversations I had with her, as I walked into the hospital, she looked at me and she said, keep doing what makes you smile. I kind of smiled, watching her in the bed. And she came up to me and she pulled my smile up and she was like, no, smile like that. That's when my smile really came out. And I realized for me, that sense of fear on my edge is continually leaning into connecting and speaking. I don't know what it is for you, but I encourage you to do it because every time we lean into the fear, it's like an on switch, not just for us, but for everyone else we're in contact with. We turn each other on like ripples or like dominoes or like light bulbs. And it's not even on a conscious level. It comes up from our nervous system and we just know life when we feel it. I've had people watch me speak from across the room and say at the start, I just wanted to talk to my friend. The moment you got up there, I couldn't take my eyes off you. And realize the fear that we're feeling, maybe it's not just our own. Maybe it's the collective fear of everyone else. Because we've all been running. We're all afraid. And we're all a bit like presents waiting to get unwrapped. invite you, what does that open up to you in your life that hasn't been there before? What can the next step in your life look like if you haven't allowed it to be? To quote another ancient text that opened doorways upon doorways for me in this path. The Bhagavad Gita, an ancient text that comes from India. It deals with this idea of a prince going to war and speaking to his charioteer. And there's a lot of these books that tend to feature God. The charioteer in this case is Krishna or God. And I always take that to mean my expanded self that I haven't gotten to know yet. You can take God to mean whatever you do. But this figure says back to him, act for action's sake and be unattached to inaction. In plain English, we don't know what happens on the other side of that doorway. But every time we step through it, we allow ourselves to discover within our lifetime. Some of you may have heard of Bonnie Ware. She was a nurse that spent the 12 last weeks with people who were dying. She got to know their fears. She got to know what they never expressed in their life. And 3 out of the 5 fears that she said were the most common, which she wrote a book about, were all to do with fear. Not living the life that others expected of us, but the ones we wanted to live for ourselves was the biggest regret of the dying. So I invite you to play with this the way a child might play with a new toy. We don't know. We don't know. But every time we step through the doorway, we allow the possibility for Metafear to show us something greater than we know. And you may have heard it when the feeling of fear comes up in your chest. And then what happens if you ignore it? Maybe it's literally, poetically, our heartbeat knocking on the inside of our consciousness saying, let me out. To quote Brene Brown, courage is a word of the heart. It means to live fully with one's heart. And I invite you, as you step through the doorway of this TEDx or tomorrow, whatever awaits you after you finish watching this, follow what's possible for you.